All right, good morning, everybody. Tori, if there are more seats available somewhere for folks, there's none left in the room.
Okay, yeah, I can see.
Thank you. Or there's one left in the room up here.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right, good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Sarah Gallagher, Senior Director of our ERASE project, which is Ending Renter Arrears to Stop Evictions. We've been working over the last 2 years on the distribution of emergency rental assistance funds through Treasury and working with many of you in the room on how to ensure that those funds got to renters in need quickly and in time to prevent eviction. So it's been a tremendous journey these last few years in building rental assistance programs, seeing the momentum around tenant protections, and then really seeing the impact that that work has had across the country. I'm sure Emily will talk about this a little bit later, but millions of renters have been prevented from being evicted and have had housing stability due to emergency rental assistance and the companion tenant protections that have been put in place. So it's been a tremendous sort of learning experiment and opportunity over the last few years, and we find ourselves now at this juncture, right, where many of our emergency rental assistance programs are shutting down, that there's funds are winding down, and we see programs closing. I think right now around 17% from our tracking of the emergency rental assistance programs are still open. So that tells you that most of them are closed and will be closing in the next few years. And so we're really excited to be with you today to really have a conversation around what is the status of evictions, where are we headed into the future in terms of eviction prevention and diversion, and what can be happening at the national level and then the state and local level to really sustain that work and build a path towards housing stability moving forward for our renters. So we have here an amazing panel, and I'll take a second to introduce them. So we have Emily Benfer, who is a visiting professor of clinical law and founding director of the Health Equity Policy and Advocacy Clinic at George Washington University Law School. Emily also served as a senior policy advisor to the White House and American Rescue Plan implementation team between 2021 and 2022, where her work focused on eviction prevention and housing policy. So it's great to have you here, Emily. We also have Samira Nazim, and she's a principal court management consultant at the National Center for State Courts, overseeing the Eviction Diversion Initiative, which is supporting state and local courts in designing, implementing, and evaluating eviction diversion programs and related court reform efforts. So it's great to have Samira talk to us about those relationships with courts at this time. And we also have community partners with us here today. We've got Michelle Mapp over at the end, who is with the ACLU of South Carolina's Equal Justice work. She's a law fellow there, which is sponsored by Alston and Bird Racial Justice Fund. And Michelle is currently working to advocate on the passage of tenant right to counsel law in South Carolina and other tenant protections that we'll hear about throughout the day. And last but not least, we have got Andrew Bradley, who is a policy director at Prosperity, Indiana. And as policy director, Andrew is working to craft and advance Prosperity Indiana's policy agenda in coordination with their members. He's working on data analysis to look at the needs of renters and what policies change is needed. And they are also working on initiatives to both advance tenant protections and to sustain emergency rental assistance into the future. And we'll hear a lot about their work and the challenges and opportunities that exist at the state and local level. So with that, we'll just let you know today some of our learning objectives. We want to learn about the status of evictions as we move out of the pandemic. We're going to talk about some of what we learned from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that could help serve renters into the future. We're going to talk about some of the core components of eviction prevention models at the state and local level, and then really learn about some advocacy strategies that can bring us forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily to kick us off. You're welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So in addition to being a faculty member at GW Law, I'm also a visiting research collaborator at the Eviction Lab. So I'm going to share some of the data that we've collected over the course of the pandemic and kind of give you the arc of what happened over the last 3 years. So before we get started into that, I want to just center us in what we're dealing with here. So before we jump into the state of eviction and eviction prevention efforts, I want to set the stage for the U.S. eviction system and what we're entering back into in this moment. So eviction, as you know, it's rooted in English feudal law that the tenant's only right was to pay the rent. And it wasn't until there were concerns about the habitability of the conditions of the units, especially in tenement housing, that we started to see landlord-tenant code evolve, some habitability issues evolve. And then in Lindsay versus Norman in 1972, yes, I'm going to go legal here, coming from the law professor, right? The Supreme Court affirmed the need for a speedy trial. So what this meant was that eviction, it became this summary judgment proceeding. It's meant to be fast. It's a conveyor belt. And the effect is still apparent today in this de-emphasis of contractual and statutory rights and the tenant's ability to mount a defense in favor of property rights of the landlord and getting them back to that piece. This is a quote from the dissent in the 1967 case, Supreme Court case. Summary eviction proceedings are the order of the day. Default judgments in eviction proceedings are obtained in machine gun rapidity, since the indigent cannot afford counsel to defend. Housing law often have built-in bias against the poor. Slumlords have a tight hold on the nation. Anyone who has set foot in housing court knows that this could be said today. Not much has changed. Often referred to as the cattle call, eviction court is designed to be fast, dockets are large, and the economic interests of landlords are the court's priority. Access to court watch studies across the country have shown us that the average hearing lasts between 90 seconds and 3 minutes in a typical urban setting, and oftentimes less. There's an average caseload of 40 to 100 cases a day, many times more if it's a larger city, and the majority of cases are decided in the landlord's favor, with courts prioritizing their economic interests again, even where habitability claims or defenses are raised. It's almost always decided in the landlord's favor. 97% of tenants lack access to counsel, compared to 10% of landlords nationwide. So you can see that there's a major power imbalance in eviction courts. So this is what we're entering back to. Nationally, in the United States, and this is the most recent culling of data from about the last 10 years, a typical non-pandemic year, 3.7 million evictions are filed annually. That's 7 every minute, even in times of low unemployment. This map depicts eviction filing rates signified by the red dots. The larger the dot, the larger the filing. Most cases are for non-payment of rent, usually for small amounts, as little as $120. Landlords frequently use the courts to control tenant behavior and to remind tenants to pay their rent. Nearly a third of households facing eviction are filed against repeatedly at the same address, which is a practice known as serial filing. So this is really demonstrating how the landlord is using this they're almost weaponizing the court system to control the tenant behavior. Serial eviction affects 14.7% of Black households compared to 9.7% of white households. And renters with evictions on their record are branded with a scarlet E. Tenant screening companies automatically reject tenants with an eviction filing, even if the tenant ultimately won the case. So the scarlet E is linked with failing credit scores, unemployment, and future evictions. And this risk of eviction is especially heightened among communities of color. After controlling for education, the Eviction Lab found that Black households are more than 2 times as likely to be evicted as white households. Black women are evicted at the highest rates, and Black women with children have the greatest risk. The average age of eviction in the United States is about 5. So what prompts eviction? First, according to the Eviction Lab, a significant number of property owners use the eviction process as a rent collection tool rather than a means of removing tenants or for other reasons. Tenants are evicted for small amounts of money, as I mentioned, as little as $120, oftentimes multiple. And tenants lack legal protections to contest eviction or supports to maintain housing. In many states across the country, tenants have to actually pay a rent bond into the court even to access the hearing process. So this really is a matter of economic disadvantage as well as discrimination. And racial disparities have persisted throughout the pandemic. The Eviction Lab tracks eviction filing rates and determined that census tracts with high Black populations have much higher rates of eviction than any other areas during the pandemic in multiple cities. These are 2 examples, Milwaukee and Cleveland. These bars show eviction by month in Cleveland and Milwaukee during the first year of the pandemic. The tall navy blue lines, I think you can see that from where you are, those represent Black renters, the red, white renters. So you can see extreme disparities in eviction filings. In turn, I don't expect you to read this. I just want you to get a sense of, I know there's a lot going on here. The eviction filings and eviction itself widen health disparities by race as well as economic aspects. I want you to take from this just how many links eviction has to health. To name a few, eviction is associated with poor physical and mental health and conditions that increase COVID-19 complications and death. For women, it's associated with physical and sexual assault and future housing precarity. Once you have one eviction, you're likely to have 2 or 3. Eviction is particularly devastating to children. I mentioned that families are most often evicted. It results in emotional trauma, developmental delay, lead poisoning and the brain damage that it causes, food insecurity, and even decreased life expectancy. For infants who are born evicted, it leads to adverse birth outcomes such as low birth weight and preterm birth. Eviction also creates barriers to livelihood. It forces renters to a downward move into rundown housing to more disadvantaged, higher crime neighborhoods. And in this way, it's actually deepening long-standing patterns of economic and housing instability and poor health among historically marginalized groups. So this is the status quo. This is what we're dealing with and what we're entering. And so during the pandemic, stopping these patterns became urgent in order to protect the public health. The question is, why isn't it still urgent? Why isn't this something that we are putting as a priority and making sure that we continue the trends that we had during the pandemic? And I want to talk about what some of those trends were and which ones worked. So the first one, we have to put this out there. I know the moratoriums aren't coming back anytime soon, but state and local courts, governments, and the CDC issued eviction moratoria that completely halted eviction across the country in most jurisdictions. On a state level, at least one state-level actor instituted a moratorium on eviction in 43 states. And this is important because I'm going to show you what happened to eviction trends in a moment. Also in DC and in 5 territories. During the first year of the pandemic, the median length of a moratorium was 144 days, almost half a year. As of June 15th, 2022, when moratorium were still in place in only California and the US Virgin Islands, the longest moratorium was 810 days in California. So in addition, as the moratorium started to expire and we saw eviction rates start to creep back up, the federal government engaged in a whole-of-government response. In addition to the CDC National Eviction Moratorium, the Biden-Harris administration launched a widespread push for funding and guidance supporting access to legal assistance and court-based eviction diversion. The Associate Attorney General Gupta sent a path-breaking letter to courts that I think you might hear a little bit more about today that resulted in the adoption of eviction diversion on a statewide level. This is the first in our nation's history, in Michigan, Indiana, and Texas, that along with many local jurisdictions, which actually diverted cases away from the court system to work it out, to get access to rental assistance and to preserve housing. For the first time, the White House hosted a series of eviction prevention summits, there were 3 in total, that were aimed at diverting evictions and actually brought stakeholders together from across the country at the highest risk areas. 99 law schools responded to the Attorney General's call to action to prevent eviction at the lifting of the CDC moratorium and provided legal counsel to tenants across the country. Nearly $230 million in ARP funding, American Rescue Plan funding, was used for increased access to legal counsel. And ERA itself increased, actually created or enhanced over 100 court-based eviction diversion programs. Courts were much more likely to implement eviction diversion when money was in hand than they were when moratoria were forced upon them. So when given resources, courts were more than willing to try to prevent these evictions. In addition, the Biden-Harris administration issued guidance to prioritize the lowest income households to get emergency rental assistance. This resulted in rapid and equitable ERA spending. By the end of 2021, 1 in 4 grantees had spent all of their ERA 1, and over half had spent 85%. So this standing up of programs that never existed before across the country. The Urban Institute studied emergency rental assistance programs leading into the delivery of ERA, and they could only find about 40. There really was nothing across the country, and certainly not at this level. By third quarter of 2022, $31 billion in ERA 1 had been paid out. Prior to the pandemic, less than $1 billion, less than $1 million had been accessible federally just to tenants who are seeking a rental assistance to prevent eviction. So when you look at the difference here and this federal commitment to actually keeping people housed, it's profound and something that we need a marker of so that we can turn back to it and try to push it forward. Over 80% of emergency rental assistance was delivered to the lowest income households, earning 50% of AMI. People who disproportionately face eviction receive the majority of those funds. 2/3 of beneficiaries were female-headed households, 40% self-identified as Black, and 20% as Latino. Over 10 million payments have been made to those most at risk of eviction as of February 2023. 10 million. Recall that there's 3.7 million evictions annually. So think about how many families avoided eviction during that time. It's really something just awe-inspiring. The result, eviction filings were nearly half of historic levels even after the CDC moratorium was lifted. So let's take a look at those data points. So I'm going to go year to year. So this is 2020, the first year of the pandemic, and you can see the dotted line. That's right when the pandemic started. And the eviction moratoria were issued on the state level and local level, and evictions dropped down to about 15%, 5%, in some places 0% of historic averages. Those two red bars are the gap, the 2-week gap between when the CARES Act moratorium expired and the CDC moratorium went into effect. So the moratorium were working. They actually halted evictions across the country for the majority of tenants. But then once those local eviction moratoria started to expire, right around the CARES Act expiration, you can see them start to spike back up. So the effect there is the CDC moratorium, keeping it about 50% of historic averages across the country. So then if we go to 2021, after the CDC moratorium expired in August, you can see that it starts to creep up a little bit more. I have here on the right, this is from the Eviction Lab and Eviction Tracker System, all of the different interventions that took place, so you can see the overlay there. So we had the CDC moratorium and expanded unemployment insurance, really helping to keep people housed, to be able to pay the rent, to avoid the eviction court system altogether. And then once those expired, the child tax credit kicked in, had an enormous impact on people's ability to stay housed. And then you can see this uptick in rental assistance in that blue line. And that's also going to have a huge impact, as we can see. But then we get into 2022, and as emergency rental assistance and all of those other interventions expired, there's this trend line across all eviction tracker system locations of evictions starting to rise. So once we remove those supports, we go back to that status quo, that machine gun rapidity, that summary judgment proceeding where people are on this conveyor belt toward eviction. This is 2022. Emergency rental assistance is dissipating. It's drying up in the majority of places. The only sites that did not see a huge spike in eviction when their emergency rental assistance dried up were those that then dedicated state and local funds to replace emergency rental assistance, had strong right to counsel programs, or maintained eviction diversion. So these interventions are working, but as soon as they're gone, we go right back to the status quo. So here you can see all 3 years. 2020, the largest impact was really the moratoria. 2021, the impact was really around rental assistance. It kept it about the same as moratoria. The courts were much more likely to implement emergency rental assistance and diversion than they were a CDC moratorium. And then in 2022, as we lose all of these interventions, we start to get right back up to status quo. Here's the entire pandemic. It tells quite a story. You can see where the interventions took place. We were able to stop eviction for the first time in our nation's history. But when you pull those interventions out from underneath the country, you also pull out the roof over people's head. So what's happening now? What can we look forward to? What do we need to lean into? Well, we still have this tremendous, unprecedented support from the Biden-Harris administration. They've issued this new actions to protect renters and promote rental affordability. They're trying to engage landlord associations across the country, and they issued a blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights. This blueprint is incredibly strong. They met with stakeholders across the country. They held multiple listening sessions to try to understand what were the best practices. They emphasize safe and decent housing conditions, the enforcement of tenant rights, the right to organize, shift that power balance, the access to just cause eviction standards, and access to alternatives like eviction diversion, right to counsel during eviction, eviction record court sealing, and other critical rights. So we now can point to the federal government and the White House as supporting these when we're going locally and trying to advance them. A note on eviction diversion and right to counsel. Again, they worked. I just really want to emphasize that. And the benefits of these, across all eviction diversion programs that have been studied, 67 to 95% of participating tenants stay housed. These are pre-pandemic results. So imagine what happened during the pandemic when you add rental assistance to these programs. 95% stay housed. 100% of eviction filings expunged. 80% of tenants avoid judgments. 90% of cases reach an agreement or mediation. And the same is true for right to counsel, if not stronger. 84% of represented tenants remain in their homes in New York City. In Cleveland, so exciting what's happening there. 93% of cases, tenants avoid a judgment. And in Connecticut, involuntary moves were prevented in 71% of cases. And it's taking off. From John Pollack here and his organization at the National Coalition on the Civil Right to Counsel, they've been tracking these across the country and supporting them, and you can see just how many cities have taken off, especially during the pandemic. A lot of 2020, 2021, 2022 years there. And there's pilot programs happening across the country with the exciting ones in Detroit and Chicago to keep an eye on, and then resolutions as well. So there's more of a connection, more of a commitment to tenant rights, to balancing the court system, to recognizing the harm. But keep in mind what's at stake here. You saw that slide of all of the health harms and the consequences for individuals. This is not just about keeping people home. It's about their futures, and not only theirs, but that of communities and the rest of the country into the years and decades ahead. I'll be happy to answer questions when we get to that point. I'll pass it on. Thank you.
Great. Next we have Samira. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Emily, thank you so much for setting the context. Emily painted a fairly bleak picture of eviction court, and not an unfairly bleak one, but I'd like to talk a little bit about how courts are trying to move beyond that and try to reimagine how eviction court could look like moving forward. Before I jump into that, I just want to thank Sarah for putting together this panel. I'm really thrilled to be here today speaking with all of you. I'm Samira Nazem. I'm with the National Center for State Courts, and I lead our eviction diversion work. And as Emily already touched on a little bit, eviction diversion existed before COVID, but it was pretty small. There were only a handful of programs across the country, and really the conditions during COVID created an environment where those programs could expand rapidly, and courts were suddenly willing to try new things at a scale we haven't seen before. And so we saw many, many new eviction diversion programs that were stood up in court systems across the country during those years. And then as the worst of the pandemic subsided, the courts had to answer some questions. They'd created emergency response programs, and the emergency was not as acute, and they weren't entirely sure what happened next. Did they shutter the programs? Did they pivot and try to restructure the programs? And that's where my organization came in. We really wanted to find ways to work with courts to think about how these eviction diversion programs could become long-term, sustainable programs that outlive any one specific crisis or moment in time, but can instead become a part of the court infrastructure and to really change how eviction court is structured and perceived and used by litigants. So from that, the idea for our eviction diversion initiative was born. And this is right now a 4-year grant program. It's funded by a gift from the Wells Fargo Foundation. And we are able to give out grants to state and local court systems across the country to hire dedicated program staff to really think about how evictions should be managed at the court level and what the goals should be. And those staff are able to build out eviction diversion programs to focus on bringing in and leveraging community partnerships and really shifting the narrative around what happens when people go to court and what the goals are. So we can move away from this assembly line that Emily described and move into more of a problem-solving, holistic model that is really focused on getting landlords and tenants the best possible outcome using existing resources. So we have currently a group of around 12 state court systems that we're working with that you can see here on this map. And I'll put in a quick plug. We're looking to add another 8 or so courts this year. We are accepting applications through April 21st. So if anyone is from a jurisdiction with a court system that might be interested in being a part of this work, please check out our website. We'd love to get some wonderful courts to work with as we continue to build on the work that's already happened to date. And I'd like to use the next few minutes of my time to just talk a little bit about what we mean by eviction diversion, looking at it from the court lens, to talk about some of the best practices we've identified, and to give some examples from what we're seeing on the ground, both from the courts that are in our cohort and from some other national leaders in this space. I know that eviction diversion is a phrase that's used in a lot of different ways to discuss a lot of different programs, and there is no monopoly on what this means, but I will tell you what I'm talking about, at least for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, when I talk about eviction diversion. When we talk about it at the National Center, we're talking about court programs. So we're really looking at programs that are using the existing court process, such as it is, for better or worse, to provide litigants with resources, information, and time to resolve their housing disputes in a less harmful way. So we're looking to find ways for people to resolve their issues that don't involve trial and judgment, to the extent that that is a possibility. And we found that resources, information, and time are kind of the three key ingredients that are necessary for a program to be successful. And I'll talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. So the first piece is resources. I'm going to start with that because I think that's really the core of an eviction diversion program. Ultimately, you need something to divert people to. If we want to take people off of this assembly line, we need somewhere else to send them. And that's where it's crucial that courts think about resources in their community and building out referral networks and thinking about how that can work in a really integrated, strategic, and seamless manner. When we talk about building out those referral networks, we talk to courts about kind of two different buckets of referrals. We need to help people move through the immediate legal crisis that is presenting in court, the thing that has brought them to court in the first place. But we can't stop there. We also need to think about the other interrelated human needs that people have when they're experiencing housing or financial instability, and to try to make connections to those services as well. So we want to look at the immediate issue and also those kind of longer-term underlying issues as well. So just a few examples here that we see many of the courts we work with thinking about. In terms of resolving the legal crisis, the key partners here are legal aid and pro bono organizations. We want to get as many people as possible the opportunity to connect with a lawyer in case they have meritorious defenses or procedural defects, or they need help settling a case. Mediation is also a really core part of many of these programs. Many times landlords and tenants just need a neutral person to help them sit down, find their common ground, and find a shared path for moving forward beyond this issue. And we found that mediation can be particularly effective in cases where there are two parties that are not represented by counsel. And then the last piece, of course, is financial assistance. The federal ERA funding was a cornerstone of many of these programs. As it starts to dissipate, we encourage courts to look for other financial assistance programs that may still be in their community. There may be other rental assistance streams that aren't ERA, but public or private streams that can be leveraged in these programs. We also look at utility assistance and other cash assistance programs that may exist in a community. We have some courts that have partnerships with landlord incentive programs that can offer financial incentives to housing providers who house at-risk tenants, and really just trying to knit together all of these different programs that exist in a kind of integrated, strategic, cohesive way so that we can respond to as many of these housing issues as possible. And looking kind of beyond that immediate legal issue, we also have courts that are now trying to bring housing counselors, financial counselors, and other social services directly into the court process so that when someone comes in, they can say, hey, you've got this one issue, but what are the other things we can help you with? Can we screen you for public benefits? Do you need a laundromat who can wash your clothes for free if you're experiencing housing instability? Do you have kids in school? Did you know that you can get access to services for homeless youth? And thinking about all of those other interrelated needs that people are experiencing. So this court process can be a jumping off point for accessing a lot of different resources that are already there in a community but may go unnoticed or underused by folks. So I want to give just a couple examples of what this looks like, because every court is different and every program is different, and there's no one way to do this work. So on the left, I have a picture here from Lawrence Township, Indiana. And this is a program that operates fully in person, and their goal is to get people in the courthouse and then to bring service providers into the courthouse too. So once they're in the door, they can make those warm handoffs. So when someone shows up at court, they check in with the clerks here, and then the first thing they see are signs that say, hey, you can go over there and talk to a lawyer, or you can go over there and apply for rental assistance. They're also doing monthly eviction sealing clinics at the courthouse so people can come in and try to get that Scarlet E that Emily mentioned erased from the record. But at the same time, they're also inviting in public benefit screeners and folks with information about accessing health care so people can come into the courthouse and learn about a whole wealth of resources that are available to support them. On the right is a picture from Chicago, Illinois, which is where I happen to live, of the eviction diversion program there, which is a fully virtual program. So all of the eviction court proceedings take place remotely on Zoom. And when a tenant logs into that Zoom call, the judge will give them an opportunity to talk to a case manager who will do a quick screen and then match them up with a legal aid organization or a mediator or a rental assistance program or some combination of all three of those. And they just move people in and out of breakout rooms, and behind the scenes they're chatting on Slack, and they're able to make a lot of different connections in real time, all from the comfort of their own home. So again, whether it's in person or virtual, it's the same idea. We want to get people into the court system, but then we want to use that opportunity to get them connected to resources. So the second element of eviction diversion programs is timing. As you heard from Emily, eviction cases move notoriously quickly, and there are many reasons for that. Sometimes there are strict statutory requirements. Sometimes it is pressure that may be placed on a system by the plaintiff community or some combination of those factors. But with all of these diversion programs, it is crucial to make sure that the individuals have time to use the resources. It's not helpful to tell someone there's a lawyer in the lobby, you can go talk to them, but you've got to be back here in 10 minutes or you're going to get a default judgment, right? That's a bad diversion program because there's no way to meaningfully access that resource. So we need to work with all of our courts to think about what does the system look like in your community and where can we reasonably try to integrate these services that will still allow your local landlord-tenant laws to function as they are written. So here's a kind of quick summary of what the eviction process looks like in most, not all places, but most places. An eviction notice is filed, the notice period expires, and then a case is filed, the tenant is served, the parties go to court, and then there's a trial and a judgment's entered. And it can feel a little bit like an automatic process where you're just moving step to step to step, and there's really not much you can do to slow it down or stop it. So with our diversion programs, what we want to do is build in off-ramps at different stages in this process so that it doesn't feel so inevitable and parties have choices that they can make along the way and opportunities to avoid moving forward to trial and potentially to eviction judgment. In our current cohort, we have courts that are focused on pre-filing intervention. So they are trying to capture landlords and tenants before they even file anything in court and to try to present alternatives to litigation. Have you considered mediation, rental assistance? Can we talk about what's going on and try to find a way to resolve this out of court? We have a number of courts that we're working with right now that are focused on post-filing programs. So once a case is filed, there's a moment in time where the case is filed, but the parties haven't yet come to court, and they're trying to use that opportunity to connect with landlords and tenants, to talk about alternatives and resources. And then we have our in-court programs where they're capturing people when they show up at court and trying to get them connected with resources at that moment in time. I think the best program probably builds in multiple opportunities to access resources. I think we can all understand that when you can avoid the eviction filing altogether, that is the best outcome. So certainly encouraging that early resolution is wonderful. It's not always practical or realistic to expect everyone to be able to resolve their issue that early. And so it's also crucial to offer these access points later on. But when the points are, that's going to vary with every jurisdiction in terms of how their program is structured, in terms of their partners, and in terms of the timing constraints that they have to work within. I want to just give a couple other examples of some of these different programs and when they're set up and how they're set up. So in terms of pre-filing, one of the things that courts have to decide is whether they want to create a mandatory or voluntary program. So there's two examples here, one from Washington, which is a statewide program, and one from Alaska, also statewide. And the programs are structured really similarly. The tenant is required, the housing provider is required to provide notice of mediation when serving a pre-filing eviction notice to the tenant. The difference is in Washington, if the tenant says they want to mediate, the landlord is required to mediate in good faith because it's mandatory. In Alaska, the housing provider is not obligated to mediate just because the tenant wants to. It's a voluntary program, so they have to think there about incentives and education and outreach and how they make this program a good alternative that housing providers would affirmatively choose to use, even if they're not obligated to. But the end result is the same in both of these. They want to get people the opportunity to mediate and apply for rental assistance and use resources before going to the court system, and really just reserving the court system for the most extreme cases that can't be resolved through these other mechanisms. Once a case has been filed and it's hit the court system, again, timing questions. How are you going to make sure that the individuals have an opportunity to use all of these resources, to talk to attorneys, to go through an intake process, to apply for rental assistance and have that application processed? We generally see two options here, assuming that the local governing landlord-tenant law can allow for one of these to happen. Either the cases will be temporarily paused pending diversion resources doing what they need to do, or the case will be slowed down. So both Indiana and Michigan are using that kind of pause model, where if a certain triggering event happens, the case will be paused for a set period of time while the parties are trying to work through the diversion resources and find an alternative way to resolve the case. Cook County uses more of this like speed bump slowdown method, where the case isn't paused for a set period of time, but they've built in an additional court date that forces a slowdown in the process so that there's an opportunity to use resources. Whereas in Cook County, the first court date used to be a trial date, which is not an uncommon way of structuring these. Now the first court date is set as a case management date. The sole purpose for it is to give people access to resources, and then they come back 2 weeks later and they can determine at that point if the case will move to trial or if they've been able to find a different way to resolve the case. All right, and then the third thing that I wanted to touch on is information. Is even the best program that has all of the resources and is structured wonderfully will fail if nobody shows up to use it. And eviction courts are plagued with low appearance rates from tenants, and there are many reasons for that. Tenants may not even know they have a case if they haven't been served properly, or if they've been served with a notice that is impossible to understand, or tenants may affirmatively opt out of coming to court if they've had a bad experience with the court system in the past and see no benefit to showing up in court. And they may have very good reasons to think that there's no benefit to showing up in court. So courts really have to try to overcome this and change this prevailing narrative that nothing good happens in eviction court, and to start pushing out a different message, that this is not an eviction mill anymore. This is a place of connection and resources that is focused on solutions and not just kind of quick evictions. And that is a bit of an uphill battle. So we talk with all of the courts that we work with about improving their existing court notices and also supplementing them so that they can push out this message in different ways. And a lot of these things are not rocket science, but they still, they don't come naturally to court. So we really try to push them on this. Look at all of the things that people receive in the mail, the notices, the summons, everything from the court. Is it written in plain language? Is it designed in a way where someone can look at it and understand what they need to do and how and why? And does it tell people what resources they can access if they come to court? The answer is often no, no, and no. And then the court has some work to do to really think about how they're communicating with people and what they want those communications to look like. In addition to that, we are pushing courts to think beyond those traditional methods of service and United States Postal and all of that, and thinking about how people connect and engage now and access information. Can courts collect phone numbers and email addresses and start supplementing those written notices with text messages and emails? Are they using social media and their websites effectively? And are they working with community outreach partners? The court may not be the right person to push out this message, especially in communities that have historical reasons for mistrusting the court system. And so who can they partner with to make sure that these messages are reaching the most vulnerable people who have the most to gain from learning about these programs? So just to give kind of a few examples of different things our courts are doing. In Grand Rapids, the court now is mailing out a flyer to every tenant once an eviction case is served. And so that's the first thing that the person hears. Before they are even served with court papers, they will get a notice from the court about diversion. So they're really trying to get ahead of this and get that information out as early as possible. Both New Jersey and Alaska are now requiring landlords, when they file a case, to provide email address and phone number for tenants so that the court can try to reach out using those other methods of service. The tricky thing with evictions is people often move, and all you've got is this address where they may no longer live. And so we can't just rely on that address as the only way to reach people when we know that they are potentially in the process of moving. And we have these other methods of communication available to us now, and the opportunities for courts to leverage those. So I'll just wrap up here with a few more examples. Here's a picture from right here in DC of court staff just going out into the community and tabling at a community event, right? Maybe we shift this idea that it always has to be the litigant who goes to court to learn about resources. Perhaps the court can come into the community and tell people about resources. In the middle is a picture of a bus shelter or train station ad in Chicago advertising their diversion program. And on the right is a flyer from Wichita, Kansas, where they're doing monthly informational sessions in libraries for landlords and tenants to explain the eviction process, but also to meet people to talk about resources, alternatives to eviction, and trying to resolve problems upstream and early when possible. And then the other piece of this outreach is landlord engagement, because all these diversion programs require buy-in and support from the housing provider community too. We need housing providers to be willing to mediate, to have a seat at the table in how these programs are structured, and to also see the benefits to housing providers too. We have many self-represented landlords who come into the diversion programs who need the same resources tenants do in terms of public benefits screening, access to health care, learning about mortgage forbearance programs, and the like. So we really want to make sure that we're getting feedback and support from all of the stakeholders here and making sure that these programs are a win-win-win for everyone and that the court system is serving all of the different stakeholders in these cases effectively. So I'll close with just a few kind of tips that I always give courts on working well with community partners. For a lot of courts, it's a little bit new to work with community partners and advocacy groups, and there are always concerns around their neutrality and whether this will violate that. And no, it's not. It's just sharing information about resources that are in the community is in no way a violation of the court's obligation to be neutral and impartial. It's simply providing information about resources that are already out there. But what we talk to courts about is making sure they understand their partners. Don't just tell everyone to call a phone number for an organization. They will get flooded with calls, right? Take the time to learn about their intake process, their eligibility criteria, timing requirements. Make sure you're checking in regularly with partners to make sure that this program continues to work for them. These programs need to iterate and evolve over time, and there need to be regular feedback loops so the court and the partners are all getting kind of what they need out of these programs. And we really encourage courts to think about how they're preparing litigants for what comes next, whether that's in their case or whether that's when they go out to contact a service provider. What do they need to do? What can they expect? What do they need to bring? And put that in writing so people can refer back to it. And then lastly, we encourage courts in a variety of different ways to share information, to share data, and to share physical and virtual space to make all these referrals and partnerships more seamless and more coordinated and effective. So with that, I will wrap up. Here's the website and email address for our eviction diversion program if you'd like to learn more, and happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Samira. That was amazing, great information to bring back to our communities and how to engage with the courts and opportunities we could do. We're now going to turn our lens to some state and local examples from our state and local partners and who are members of our race program as well, which is very exciting. So first we have Michelle Mapp, and Michelle, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. I don't have slides because I'm going to tell you a story. So my name is Michelle Mapp. Sorry. My name is Michelle Mapp, and I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the ACLU of South Carolina. And I bring you greetings from North Charleston, South Carolina, what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the belly of the beast, and what we call locally Confederate Disneyland. While that's funny, the reality is not. In 2016, when the Eviction Lab first published its national rankings of evictions, City of North Charleston rated #1 in the country. Columbia, South Carolina rated #8. 42 of South Carolina's 46 counties were in the top 100 in evictions in the country. We have a crisis in our state, and it's a result of years of public policy. And so I call this the politics of evictions, because that's what we're living through in South Carolina. In South Carolina, it's $40 to file for an eviction. It's the third lowest rate in the country. In South Carolina, tenants can waive their right to notice of an eviction in their lease. In South Carolina, once an eviction is filed, a tenant has to answer, and they have 10 days in which to do so. So you can clearly understand why not having an attorney in the process leads to detrimental results. In South Carolina, we're a state of only 5 million people, so I like to say we're a big city. But we are seeing every day the result of the impacts of evictions. And what I will say is that I not only represent South Carolina, but I think I represent this issue in the South. If you look at a lot of the data of where, solutions are being implemented, there's not a lot of places in the South because there are a lot of challenges. In South Carolina, I will tell you, on the left, we're just happy to have a tenant landlord act, no matter how bad it is. On the right, I'll just leave it at that. And so we are facing these challenges day in, day out to convince folks that this is an issue, that it matters to the lives of people, but also that there's an economic cost to all of these evictions. So why the ACLU? Well, within the ACLU, this work is in our Access to Justice space under the Women's Rights Project because we know disproportionately evictions impact women, particularly African American women. And so in South Carolina, having worked for about 13 years for a community development financial institution that was funding affordable housing, when the Eviction Lab report came out in 2016, I think we all knew it, but to see it in print really meant something. And so for me personally, I recognized that we could have all the capital in the world and that we could build all the housing units, affordable housing units in the world, but if we weren't doing anything to stem the tide of evictions of the folks once they got into those housing units, and we were seeing just as many evictions from public housing units, from low-income housing tax credit units, that something needed to be done. And so that's what led me to law school and to an internship with the ACLU, who was looking at what we could do about this. We decided that the best course of action was figuring out how we could implement right to counsel in South Carolina. We were following what was happening at the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, began to participate and listen in on some of their calls, seeing what was happening around the country. But what we very quickly recognized is that legislation was not going to be enough and that we needed to help support and build the infrastructure for this work in our state. We already knew we had a problem in that we didn't have enough attorneys on the criminal side, so we knew we weren't going to have enough attorneys on the civil side, and especially not enough attorneys who were doing housing-related work. We knew that in our state, with a Republican legislature and a Republican governor, that it wasn't enough to say that this was bad and it was harming families, that we needed to make an economic case of why this was good dollars and cents for our state. And we also recognized that we needed to demonstrate that this could work. And so some of what we've done in South Carolina, in 2019, our South Carolina Access to Justice Commission petitioned the South Carolina Supreme Court to allow for a pilot housing court. They agreed, and we started a pilot housing court in Charleston County, which was the worst in the state, in 3 magistrate courts. The success of that pilot housing court that allowed for the Supreme Court in 2021 to expand it to all of the magistrate courts in Charleston County. And then this year, I'm happy to say, they've expanded and allowed for that housing courts to be established statewide. So what were our results? The goal was to stem the tide of tenants being evicted. The success, 90% of tenants represented are not evicted. What was the result? The result really demonstrated that increased representation can ensure evictions are lawful, defenses are effectively asserted, and help to secure other relief. We recognize, and I think all of us who do this work recognize, that the goal at the end of the day may not be to prevent someone from being evicted, but the goal really is to prevent a disruptive displacement, to have someone and their children and their belongings set out on the side of the street. And so we recognize that oftentimes having an attorney is part of that process to help negotiate a move out, to help negotiate the terms and conditions. You know, if you have to pay back rent, it's really hard to have a deposit for a new place to go. So really recognizing the reality of people on the street. And I think we learned a lot through the pilot housing court and are excited about the expansion of those housing courts across our state. The other thing, as I said, that we quickly realized is that we didn't have enough attorneys. You know, in some counties in South Carolina, we have a lot of attorneys. In other counties, there are no attorneys. There are hardly any legal aid organizations working, and so we recognized that we needed to build that infrastructure. Fortunately, as an Equal Justice Works fellow, I had heard about what was happening in Richmond, Virginia. So when City of North Charleston was ranked #1 in the country in evictions, Richmond, Virginia was ranked #2. And Equal Justice Works had started a program in 2019 in Richmond called the Equal Justice Works Housing Justice Program, where they were putting law fellows and community organizers in legal aid organizations to provide direct representation to tenants and to work alongside low-income communities. And so part of my pitch in my project was all the reasons why I thought they should expand the program to South Carolina. And so last year, EJW expanded the housing justice program to Maryland and to South Carolina. So now in South Carolina, we have fellows in South Carolina Appleseed, Charleston Pro Bono Legal Services, South Carolina Legal Services, and Charleston Pro Bono. And so we have both attorney fellows as well as organizers now working in South Carolina. And I'm happy to say that the Housing Justice Program is going to pilot in South Carolina an in-law school fellowship program, recognizing that maybe once folks graduate or are about to graduate, it's too late then to convince them to go into housing work. But if they do it while they're still in law school, and if there's a clinic and there's a means for them to understand what does it mean to be an attorney who's focused on housing law. And so we're excited because we recognize that we can pass right to counsel in our state, but ultimately, if there are not attorneys who can help represent folks, we're going to be creating a new problem in our state. And so we're really focused on trying to create that infrastructure within South Carolina. And then working, again, and John Pollock is here, and so I do want to thank him because he's been a tremendous resource to me and to our organization as we've done this work. And so, you know, called him up and said, we have previously had right to counsel legislation that was introduced in South Carolina. It was basically like a one-liner that says we want right to counsel and nothing else. And so we recognized that we needed some model legislation or a starting point. And so John provided that to us. And so this year we have a bill, H3844, if any of you live in South Carolina, that we are, you know, in the first of a 2-year legislative session that we're trying to pass. We recognize that in order to pass this legislation, one, that legislators needed to hear from tenants. And so in South Carolina, we now have what's known as the South Carolina Housing Justice Network, which is a tenant organizing movement that was started and is being led by tenants. South Carolina has the lowest rate of unionization in the entire country. That's why we call it the belly of the beast. And so you can imagine this whole idea and concept of tenants coming together and thinking about, for a lack of a better word, unionization has really disrupted the status quo in South Carolina. But we also recognized that we needed the economics. What does this mean? And so we partnered with Stout, who many of you may know is a for-profit economic analysis firm that has done a lot of work around the country to help municipalities understand the cost and benefits of implementing right to counsel. And so over the course of a year, they worked with us in South Carolina to develop a model of what this would look like. Based on that data, we now know that for every $1 that we would spend on right to counsel, we would see $3 in economic benefits, and that on average about 19,000 South Carolina residents would avoid eviction based on having right to counsel. The estimate for our program is about $7 million a year. We are proposing to fund that both through ERA funds, and we unfortunately are one of those states that has not spent our ERA funds fully like some other states. But U.S. Treasury has said up to 10% of those funds can be used to fund programs like right to counsel. And so when we got to the end of ERA 1 and still had funds left over, our state was one of those states who said we want to hold back 10%, and this is one of the things that we want to use it for. Our other idea, which is controversial for some folks, is that we have said it's only $40 to file an eviction in South Carolina. If we increase that to just $80, there would be enough money both to fund the program based on our current rate of evictions and have a surplus. And so right now in South Carolina, on the criminal side, if you avail yourself of a right to counsel in South Carolina, those folks are charged $40. They can ask for it to be waived, but they are charged $40 as well. So we're saying this is just a very similar funding mechanism in South Carolina. We know that that would have two impacts. Both it reduces the number of frivolous and sort of serial evictions, as well as creating this funding source to help fund evictions. I think on a more broader scale, what I want to talk about is just the advocacy that's needed in terms of right to counsel. And I can't tell you how many legislators I have heard this year who say, we are not hearing from people. I had one Republican legislator said, I called up a housing provider in the state who I know, cares about these issues, and this is top of mind. And I said, hey, why haven't I heard from you on this issue? And he said, the person said to him, because I knew it wouldn't pass. And so I just would encourage us to have faith and believe that we can make a difference, and that we have to use our voices. And even when we think that the odds are against us, that we're operating in political environments where it seems like folks do not care and that they're more concerned with all the other noise that we're hearing in our country right now, is that when they do hear from us, they do stop and listen. And so, make that call. Go see, the legislator or the council person in your local district and talk about, what we've heard today, the impacts, because these are real lives and real people. And I will finally sort of end with this. How I came to this work and how I came to housing is I was a high school math teacher in a Title I school. In the community where I taught, there was no bank, there was no grocery store, there was not any place for my students to go buy pencil and paper if they needed it. I very quickly realized that the challenges in my school had far less to do with what was happening within the walls of that school and everything to do with the substandard housing that surrounded the school, the lack of options in that community, that there were students who were sleeping on other students' couches, that we had to have a person at our school who all she did was handle the housing issues for our students. Our children deserve better. Our children deserve better. And so as we, right now in this country are debating about parental rights, and we're debating about book bans and all this other stuff, at the end of the day, we all should be concerned about ensuring that our children have a safe, decent, secure place to lay their head at night. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for your story. That was a wonderful presentation, Michelle. Next, we have Andrew Bradley, who is going to pick up a theme that Michelle talked about and talk about some of the opportunities and struggles with local advocacy in Indiana. So I hand it over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank everybody in this room. For those of you who are joining us online, this room has been standing room only the whole time. So I want to thank the people who are standing and those who are sitting and who are online. I'm going to try to be as short as possible so that we can open this up into a conversation. But I do want to talk about, let's see if I can advance this. So again, my name is Andrew Bradley, and I'm Policy Director with Prosperity Indiana. We're the statewide association for community economic development. So really, we have a broad range of issues we work on. Affordable housing, community development resources, asset building, consumer protections. And yet, we've had to spend a lot of our time working on eviction prevention issues, especially since the pandemic, but really it's a pre-existing crisis. So in Indiana, we may not be the belly of the beast, but there's a saying in Indiana that Indiana sometimes acts as the middle finger of the South, extending up into the North, if you look at the map. And we have the policy outcomes to prove it, unfortunately. We have a very conservative supermajority legislature, which means that the minority legislators don't even have to be in the room. That means that a lot of the decisions happen in caucus, behind closed doors, and those decisions are made before issues even come about. So we have to find ways to bring the issues to light and to try to convince that supermajority to consider the issues that we're talking about today. And while we have some well-meaning people in the state administration and in the courts, they're often risk-averse. Back to the General Assembly, it's in some ways very industry captured. One representation of the housing industry once said, "We own this place," to one of our state partners. So again, that's kind of the uphill battle that we're looking at. So that is played out in that really lopsided landlord-tenant policy structure. And as I have here, our community service and our advocates are often under-resourced. We're kind of scrapping for grants here or there. So really appreciate this Erase project gave us that ability to come together, get technical assistance, and to be able to work specifically on these issues. And then again, across Indiana, our tenant population, we don't have one of the biggest cities, and so that population is really diffuse across the state. And if you recall, yesterday when Matthew Desmond was there, one of our good partners, Dee Ross, I think he's here in the room, spoke to Matthew Desmond. There's Dee, yeah, thanks. Reminding him that Indianapolis has the second highest number of eviction filings in the nation, according to those Eviction Lab stats, among big cities. And that was even before the pandemic. 3 of our cities are in the top 20 for the highest percentage of evictions. And then there's a lot of small towns and rural areas that have even higher rates of eviction than that. So this, again, was a really pre-existing crisis that was just brought to the forefront by the pandemic. So in terms of some of the strategies that you can see here, we've tried to do an inside-outside, trying on the inside to be able to get to those legislators, to be able to tell them that this is not just a big city issue. It's also a suburban issue. It's also a rural issue. It's in their hometown. Changing that narrative also through media stories, being able to use things like the Eviction Lab data and all the resources that we've been talking about so far to publicly make this be known. And then on the inside, we have been trying to shape how the state and local programs have used ERA funds, how they've used some of those admin funds to create a housing stability network and court-based programs. And then also, in a state like ours, we're always playing that long game. So let me show you a couple of things of what I mean. One thing is my organization is that Prosperity Indiana on the right, but those members themselves can't shape and change policy by ourselves. So we created at the beginning of the pandemic the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. So that's D. That's all these other members that you see there. And then we also are NLIHC members, state partners. I'm also proud to be on the NLIHC board. And we are using the Opportunity Starts at Home model to bring in multi-sector partners, people who don't work in housing every day. And okay, so I already told you this stuff, those inside outside. So one thing we do is we do rely on data. I want to really avoid trying to spit a bunch of facts at you. You've already heard a lot. But in Indiana, according to Eviction Lab's eviction tracking system, there have been 161,000 evictions filed since the pandemic began. And that comes out to 1 in 5 renter households. Now, of course, some of that's going to be the repeat filers that Emily talked about. And we've also analyzed census household pulse data. We can show that it is Black and brown households, it is female-led households, it's families with children who bear the brunt of housing instability. We also look at, there's the National Equity Atlas, has a rent debt dashboard that looks ahead, predicting using, or it's a snapshot of what's currently happening, using that census household pulse data. And for Indiana, I just checked it this morning, there's 87,000 households that are estimated to be currently at risk of eviction, including 150,000 children in those households. So that's the type of information we try to put out there. And what you see here is how we try to engage outside partners who are trusted by our legislature to try to increase that conversation. So you can see here the Notre Dame Law School has put out a report, and we've helped talk with them about that. The Indiana University IU McKinney Law School helped identify that Indiana is one of only 6 states that doesn't allow tenants who are facing health and safety issues to be able to put their rent into escrow account. Or repair and deduct the issue themselves. And we think that contributes to this high rate of evictions. You have people who are withholding rent because there's mold growing in their apartment, there's raw wiring hanging down. And Indiana law is so lopsided that you can evict somebody within 72 hours. Yeah. And, but I don't want to say, given all that, our job as advocates is we're trying to say, how can we make as much lemonade as possible out of this? And frankly, when I come to sessions like this, that's what I'm looking for, is not just, well, that's a terrible story, or that's an interesting program, but it's like, what can I do with that? So I'm trying to think about how to tell this story in terms of how can you take the different threads that are in your community and situation, put them together, and try to make the most lemonade possible. So part of that is this inside strategy that I mentioned. So both of these programs are using that housing stability services. And, hopefully your state or city has done something like this. But what we've done is Prosperity Indiana and our partners have worked with this group on the right to construct this network of case managers and housing counselors. And we're hoping to make that a permanent part. If you listen to Wally Adeyemo from Treasury earlier this morning, he's saying they're hoping from the White House that that's a legacy of the ERA program, is to be able to create lasting infrastructure. And that's our intent. And a thing we have moving forward is trying to find gap funding to keep this going after ERA funds fall away and before the Eviction Crisis Act passes. So tomorrow when we go to the Hill and advocate for that, that's why we need to see that Eviction Crisis Act funded in order for these programs to not die on the vine. On the left, that is the Indiana Bar Foundation used their portion to be able to create this Indiana Legal Help website, and also kiosks that are now in courtrooms and in public places like libraries to provide legal help on housing, but on also other issues for low-income legal needs. So that's kind of the inside strategy. Then let's see here. There we go. Okay, I can't take credit for this. This is Dee and some of the other partners had a housing advocacy day earlier this session, and he launched the Indiana Tenants Association. And that's the first statewide network. So making sure that we're using the advocacy and resources that we have to lift up those tenant-centered voices throughout the state. Meanwhile, my organization and then the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition, we've been doing that advocacy work. We've been working with those legislators in order to align that grassroots and grasstops engagement. Let's see. So just to, yes, this is that, like, trying to change the narrative. We have been trying to use what we know about the media environment. We've been trying to use the data, use those stories to make sure that we inject this into the public consciousness. And the reason that that's important is that we've been able to influence legislation that created the first eviction filing ceiling in Indiana. You heard Samira earlier talking about how there's the Lawrence Township pilot program where people go there and they can file or have their eviction sealed. And that's possible because of the legislation we passed last year. I'd like to say that that's because we influenced all those legislators and changed their minds. No, that was an industry bill. The same people I told you about before that says we run this place had that in their own bill because we created such a stink about eviction filings. The other part of that bill is they made sure that the landlord-tenant settlement program that also you mentioned, it has to be voluntary. So it's there, in no way can it be they be forced to go through it. However, even that has a benefit. Talked about that time is one of the benefits in the court system. So even going in, judges can say, I'm going to give you the option to go through this settlement conference program, and that can buy some tenants some more time to get out, to find the resources, to catch up on rent, try to make some more lemonade. So really, you can see here, these are the things that we're working on in the future. We're working on that pilot fund, like I said, that gap funding until we can get the Eviction Crisis Act passed. We're trying to get our governor to appoint a commission on housing and homelessness to be able to address these issues in a way that brings together all of our agencies and the court systems and community organizations and advocates at the same table. And then that inside strategy, continuing to work with the courts, with the local and state providers on ERA, and that's what we have coming up in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And we have just a few minutes left. And so I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
I would like to ask the panel, because Mr. Bradley talked about changing the narrative, if we can stop referring to landlords as housing providers. Unless you're going to call me a mortgage provider or a retirement provider. Like, that's buying into the landlord narrative. I'm very skeptical about mediation programs. We see a lot of times that tenants provide defensive defective notice that gets sort of overlooked because of mediation, and that mediation can lead to a lot of negative outcomes for our tenants. We're seeing boilerplate leases that have mandatory mediation in them. What can we do about those, pushing back on those boilerplate leases?
So I just want to say I agree with you. I have yet to find a study that demonstrates that mediation alone results in preventing eviction. However, there are studies that show that if you add access to an advocate or counsel for the tenant within the mediation, it actually allows it to be balanced. And the Housing First, or the Boston program actually did that, and they've shown that tenants have stayed housed up to 36 months later in the same unit after that equitable mediation occurred with the advocacy in place.
And if I could just add to that, I mean, every court system I've ever worked with has tension between the legal aid advocates and mediators for all the obvious reasons, right? Everyone is concerned a tenant's going to inadvertently waive a substantive defense in mediation, and that's a very real concern. And we talk a lot about screening and identifying cases that are a good fit for mediation, what needs to go to legal aid. Ideally, yes, there will be a legal aid advocate and a mediator, and we have a couple of jurisdictions where they have resources to do that, but realistically, most jurisdictions can't do that. And so we try to figure out what are the, I would never recommend someone go to mediation, they have subsidized housing, for example, or a history of violence, right? I mean, there are obvious things where mediation's not a good fit. We often try to use it more for double pro se cases or cases maybe where there's kind of a family history and there's a relationship between the parties and there are other issues besides the immediate legal issue. And so some of it does come down to screening and really understanding when these resources are best used. And also sometimes it comes down to being pragmatic and compromising. We do generally see around, and not all mediation programs are the same. Some of them are, everyone's gone through a 40-hour mediation training. Some of them it's more like, oh, it's a lawyer who thinks they're a mediator because they settle cases sometimes, right? Obviously, those are not the same. And so kind of comparing those outcomes aren't always apples to apples. But for programs where it's all certified mediators, we generally see around 60% success rate, and about half are pay and stay agreements and about half are move out agreements.
Great. Thank
Just
you.
one last note on mediation. One thing we found in New York, we just want to make sure that we're not replicating the court system in a different setting. And so a lot of these mediation programs that have popped up during the pandemic have a form that the mediator's using, that this is the first time that they're really engaged in eviction. And reviewing some of those forms, the first question you would see is, how much rent is due? There's an assumption that the landlord's statement of rent due is accurate. And that's not always the case. When you have an attorney, they'll show the tenant, here are the defenses you have that cut that down. Here are the habitability issues that mean you were overpaying for months. Here's why you need your security deposit back. So you could have mediators, but adding those additional screenings that balance out the defenses on both sides are really important to make it more equitable, that you might not see in the court system, let alone without that advocate. But any of those types of trainings are important.
Great. Thanks.
Hello. This question would have been for Wally if I would have got the chance to ask it downstairs. But I would love to hear you guys' recommendations and suggestions around this. With the ERA funds, emergency rental assistance dollars, when it was dispersed out throughout the U.S., in Indianapolis, for example, a lot of the dollars went to the traditional organizations. And during the pandemic, the doors was closed. So they didn't have no way to getting those dollars to the people that was directly impacted the most. What would you recommend how to better track those dollars to make sure it's reaching the people directly impacted the most? And then the other question is, with the emergency rental assistance dollars, over 40% of the landlords refused to take the emergency rental assistance dollars. And so that adds to the increase of evictions in our community, in our city. And so that would have been my question for Wally, but I would love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback.
Well, to the second part of that question, what I would say is that what we're seeing, so when North Charleston was #1 in eviction rates, City of Charleston was #1 in the country in gentrification. And so understanding that these are also land use issues, and so in high rate markets, what we're seeing is that the landlord don't want eviction rental assistance because they want those tenants gone because they are in high demand markets where they know they can charge higher rents and get new tenants. And so understanding sort of the water in which you're swimming makes a difference.
Thanks. I don't think we only have time for one more question because we are going into the organizing award ceremony. So I know there was a question here.
Thank you all so much for your work. Michelle, whatever you're eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we want to know what that is. We want to be you when we grow up. My name's Matt. I work in Boston for a nonprofit called Home Start, providing the services, Emily, that you were just describing. And a number of years ago, we worked with the Housing Authority to understand the economic implications of their evictions. They are now paying us to prevent the evictions they're trying to execute. private institutional property owners are now paying us to prevent the evictions they're trying to execute because their ROI is significant. And so this is more just as an appeal to audience. If anybody here around the country is working on opening up other sort of financial, economic engines to fund eviction prevention work, while in parallel we're supporting right to counsel legislation and pushing hard in the state and federal and local levels. If anybody has any interest in unlocking some of those, I would love for you to contact me. It's Matt. You can find me at Home Start in Boston. And I apologize that this is not a question to the panel, but it's like an invitation. It's just a please invitation for us to unlock as many revenue streams as possible for this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And let's thank our panelists for today. And I know there's more questions, but I'm sure they'll be around to help answer them. Answer them throughout the day or the afternoon, or you can email them because their contact is there. Now we're headed back to the ballroom for our organizing awards. So I'll see you all there. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our wonderful panelists.